The shovel struck steel, not rock, not root. A hard, wrong note that traveled up the handle and into her bones. Meredith froze in the September dirt, 78 years old, and suddenly very still. She brushed the clay away with band until the shape came clear. 1918, buried deeper than memory had any right to reach. Someone had brought it home from the war. Someone had decided the ground was safer than daylight. She wrapped it in canvas, drove into town. Let the young gunsmith look at it for 4 seconds before he told her it was beyond saving. She said nothing, drove home. The workshop had been locked since Thomas died. She stood before the door now, key in her hand. The lock turned. She pushed it open. There are moments that define you, not the big ones. Not the graduations or the promotions or the ceremonies in rooms that don't appear on any public record. Not the handshakes from generals, whose names you'll never be allowed to say out loud. The small ones, the quiet, humiliating ones. The ones where someone looks at everything you are, everything you've spent a lifetime becoming, and sees nothing. Nothing worth pausing for. Nothing worth a second glance. Those are the moments that show you who you actually are, because what you do next is the answer to a question you didn't know you were being asked. Meredith Voss was 78 years old when she found out what her answer was. She drove a 1987 Ford pickup that had no business still running. The kind of truck that coughed at stoplights, like a man clearing his throat in church. That leaked something unidentified, from somewhere unidentifiable, which she'd decided years ago was simply the truck's way of marking its territory. That had a crack in the windshield, shaped exactly like the state of Tennessee, which Thomas had pointed out 14 years ago, with quiet delight of a man who found accidental geography funny, and which she had never once thought about fixing, because the crack didn't affect visibility, and Tennessee was a perfectly acceptable state to have in your windshield. She drove it anyway, every morning. Down the gravel path that crunched, the same way it crunched since her father's time. Past the old oak that had been there longer than the farmhouse, longer than the road, longer than anyone's memory of this particular stretch of Virginia. Past the rusted gate that squealed in the same squealed in since 1987, which was either charming or annoying depending on your mood, and her mood was usually fine. Past the mailbox Thomas had put in crooked 30 years ago, and that she had never straightened because it worked perfectly fine at a crooked angle, and the world had enough people trying to straighten things that didn't need straightening. 30 acres, Lexington, Virginia. Population. That was how Meredith Voss described it, not out loud. She didn't describe things out loud much anymore. There was no one to describe them to, and she'd never been the type to narrate her own life for the pleasure of hearing it said. But in her head, at exactly 5:47 every morning, while the coffee brewed in the kitchen that smelled like 40 years of coffee and wood smoke and the particular cleanness of old stone, she did a quiet accounting of her world. 30 acres. 1 farmhouse, 4 bedrooms, 2 of which she never entered anymore. 1 workshop behind the farmhouse, locked. 1 pickup truck of suspicious vintage. 1 vegetable garden expanding yearly because there was always more ground and always more time. And always the particular satisfaction of putting something in the earth in it. Watch decide to live. And 1 woman, 78 years old. Widowed 5 years. Stubborn in the specific way that people become stubborn when they've spent decades being right about things nobody asked them about, in rooms nobody knew existed, for reasons nobody was allowed to explain. That was the full inventory. She liked it that way. Always black. Always been. Thomas used to put cream in his, which she had tolerated for 41 years with the quiet forbearance of a woman who understood that marriage was fundamentally an exercise in accepting that another person would do things differently than you, and that this was fine. More than fine. This was the whole architecture of it. The way two people build a life not by becoming identical, but by accommodating each other's small wrong-headedness with enough grace that the accommodation itself becomes a kind of love. He put cream in his coffee. She thought it was a waste of good coffee. She never said so. He never asked, but the cream had been his, so now the coffee was black, which was correct. Which was how it should have been all along, honestly. And she was aware of the small dishonesty involved in thinking that and was fine with it. She drank it in the chair by the window, the leather one. His leather one. Technically, though she had stopped thinking of it that way sometime in the second year after he died. Grief does that. It renegotiates ownership. It redistributes the ordinary objects of a life until you cannot remember which things were whose, and everything is just yours now, which is both a mercy and the loneliest possible thing. Outside the window, the September morning was doing what September mornings do in the Shenandoah Valley, taking its time, going golden at the edges. Mist still sitting in the low fields like something that hadn't decided to leave yet. The old oak catching the first light and throwing it back in pieces, the way old things do. Not cleanly, not all at once, but in fragments that land where they land. The kind of morning that had no opinion about anything. That simply existed, the way mornings do when nobody needs them to be remarkable. Meredith watched it, finished her coffee, put on her garden clothes. The faded green ones. The ones with the stain on the left knee from when she'd knelt in the compost pile 2 summers ago and not noticed until she was back inside. And Noelle, who had been visiting, had said, "Mom, your knee," with the expression of someone identifying a crime scene. The ones Noelle kept to throw away on her next visit. They're perfectly good clothes. Noelle, Mom, they have a stain. Everything worth wearing has a stain. She pulled on her boots. The same ones she'd been wearing for 11 years, resoled twice by the same cobbler in town who had stopped commenting on their condition, and simply resoled them. Because she brought them in with the quiet expectation who understood that a good boot was worth maintaining, and he had eventually come around to agreeing. Lace them, the way Thomas had taught her in 1979. The year they'd started hiking together on weekends, a hobby that had lasted 12 years before her knees had opinions. Left over right. Then the loop on the right side first, which was apparently the correct way, and which she had been doing wrong for 30 years before he showed her. Some habits go so deep they stop being decisions. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down, picked up her gardening gloves, went outside. The garden had started small, a modest plot behind the kitchen, maybe 10 feet by 12. Tomatoes, some squash, a few rows of beans. The kind of garden a person starts because they have the space and the time and a vague feeling that they should be growing things. That growing things is what people do when they have land and mornings with nothing immediately urgent in them. That was 20 years ago. It had expanded, not aggressively, not according to any plan. But every spring there was a new section, a new row, a new border, pushed out another few feet into the grass. The garden grew the way purpose grows in people who don't have anywhere else to put it, slowly, steadily, filling the available space with something alive, something that needed attention and rewarded it. Something that had its own schedule and didn't care about yours this morning, she knows. She was breaking new ground on the east side, the section nobody had touched in years, possibly decades. The ground was different here from the cultivated soil of the main garden, compacted, old, the specific density of earth that has been left alone long enough to forget what it's like to be disturbed. It pushed back against the shovel with a dull resistance that she'd learned to work around rather than against. Because resistance like that rewarded patience and punished force, which was true of most things. She had been at it for an hour, maybe more. She didn't wear a watch in the garden. Time in the garden was a different kind of time, measured in progress, not minutes, in feet of turned earth. In the particular muscle fatigue that settled into your shoulders when you'd been doing honest work and couldn't pretend otherwise, The September morning had warmed. The mist was gone. The old oak threw a long shadow across the grass, and she worked in and out of it, in the light, and then the shade, the way you move through any day. She drove the shovel down again, hit something. The sound was wrong. Not the dull thud of rock which she'd hit before in this garden and learned to read. Rock had a certain finality to it, a stubbornness that was purely geological and held no information. Not the soft resistance of a root which gave and then gave more, a kind of yielding argument. This was different, metallic, a ringing note almost, clear and brief. Like the ground had a bone. She stopped. Looked down at the shovel, looked at the ground. Probably a pipe-old property. 4 generations. Pipes got laid and forgot. She'd hit one before years ago. On the west side, an old irrigation line from her grandfather's time, corroded, solid, and useless, but still technically there. She dug around it with the shovel more carefully now. Moved the soil to the side in deliberate strokes. Old habit from work she'd done for decades in a completely different context. You work around a thing before you commit to lifting it. You find out what you're dealing with first. Assumptions are expensive. The shape started emerging. Long, narrow. Curved at one end in a way that was specific. Intentional. A pipe wouldn't curve like that. She set the shovel down. Got on her knees. The left one protesting in the way it had been protesting for 6 years. The same dull complaint every time, which she had mostly stopped acknowledging, put because there was no version of her life in which she stopped kneeling in her own garden. She used her hands, brushed the soil away in careful strokes. The object emerged from a bridge like something being torn, or like something returning, rust everywhere. The kind of deep orange-brown corrosion that comes from decades, more than decades, in wet soil. The kind that turns steel into something that looks more like geology than engineering. Layered, textured, a surface that had been having its own slow conversation with the earth while nobody was paying attention. Meredith sat back on her heels. Her hands were shaking slightly. They did that sometimes now. The arthritis in her knuckles, the general renegotiation of 78 years that her body conducted daily without asking her permission, normal, manageable. Her eyes were not shaking. Her eyes had gone very still, very quiet. Very focused in the way that eyes focus when a brain that has been running at half capacity for a long time suddenly recognizes something and fires up every circuit it has, all at once without announcement. She could see it. Under the rust, under the corrosion, the geometry of it, the angle of the receiver, the specific curve of the bolt housing, the profile, unmistakable to eyes that had learned to read it in 1969, in a workshop at Fort Belvoir. In the first week of the first job she'd ever had that mattered, and that she had spent the next 4 decades knowing the way you know the shape of your own hands. Better, maybe. You don't look at your own hands as often as you think Springfield. The thought arrived quietly. No fanfare. Arrives when it has nothing to prove and nowhere to be Springfield, model 1903. She sat in the mud of her own garden on a Tuesday morning in September, holding a rifle that had been in the ground longer than most of the trees on her property, and she felt something happen in her chest that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not excitement, exactly. Something older than excitement. Something that lived underneath all the years of retirement and solitude and grief and black coffee in a church chair at 5:47 in the morning. Something that had been there the whole time, waiting, the way good steel waits under bad rust. Recognition, the kind that goes all the way down. She brought it inside wrapped in a piece of canvas from the workshop. Not the workshop she'd been avoiding. There was canvas in the barn. There was always canvas in the barn, covering things, protecting things, doing the patient work of preservation that nobody thought about until they needed it. She put on the Sapex's second shelf, shook the dust off, wrapped the rifle carefully, set it on the kitchen table, which was not where you were supposed to put things like this. The kitchen table was for coffee and newspapers, and the occasional letter from Noel and, once, a birthday cake that Thomas had made from scratch, with the solemn concentration of a man attempting surgery. The kitchen table was not a restoration examination surface, but she didn't have anywhere else cleared, and she wasn't ready to open the workshop yet. Not yet. She stood over it for a long time, made another coffee she didn't drink, set it on the counter where it went cold while she looked at the object on her table and let her eyes do the slow, methodical work they'd been trained to do. You look first. Always look first. You let your eyes do the work before your hands get involved. The hands want to move, want to touch, want to begin the physical conversation. The eyes are more patient. The eyes can hold more information at once. The eyes don't have preferences the way hands do. What she saw, the stock was almost entirely gone, rotted down to fragments that clung to the rusted frame, like the memory of a shape. You could see the ghost of what it had been, the curve of the pistol grip, the line of the forestock, but the wood itself had surrendered to the soil over whatever decades it had spent there. The barrel was one so encrusted with corrosion that she couldn't determine caliber by sight alone, which meant the rust layer was substantial, not surface, not cosmetic, something that had been building for a long time. The bolt assembly was frozen solid, fused by decades of oxidation into something that looked more like a geological formation than a mechanism, a single piece, immovable, apparently. Any reasonable person would have seen scrap, a doorstop, a curiosity, something to show at dinner parties, and then put on a shelf in the garage where it would gradually stop being interesting. Meredith was not unreasonable. She understood exactly what other people would see. She'd spent 43 years understanding exactly what other people saw when they looked at objects that appeared to be beyond saving. And she'd spent those same 43 years knowing that what other people saw and what was actually there were frequently two completely different things. She'd been seeing underneath things for 43 years. The stock fragments told her the wood had been walnut. The color and texture of what remained was consistent with American black walnut, the standard material for military Springfields. The receiver, under the rust, had the specific geometry she expected. Oct was approximately right for the standard military configuration. The overall length, she measured it against the table with her hands, was in the right range. She took out her notebook, the same kind she'd used for 43 years. Leather-bound. The one she ordered from a supplier in Ohio, because they were the right size and the right weight and the paper took pencil well. And she had never seen the point in changing what worked. She set it open beside the rifle and began writing. Dimensions. Condition. Preliminary observations. The systematic accounting of what she had. Then she cleaned a small section with a cotton swab and mineral spirits. A postage stamp area on the left side of the receiver, just enough to see what was underneath without committing to anything. The steel beneath was not perfect. Nothing was perfect after this long in clay soil, but it was intact. The machining marks were still there, faint but legible to eyes that knew what to look for. The geometry of the surface was what it should be. She leaned close. The magnifying glass from the kitchen drawer, not her good one, that was in the workshop, but adequate. Hovering over the steel, and there, in the metal, the ghost of letters, stamped deep, a century ago, by machines in a Massachusetts armory that took pride in their tolerances. Springfield Armory. She went closer. Below the roll mark, more characters. She cleaned a wider area, carefully, the way you approach any revelation, slowly, so you have time to understand what you're seeing before you have to react to it. 448312. The serial number. She sat back, wrote it in the notebook, underlined it once. Manufactured at the peak of American involvement in the First World War. The year the United States put its full weight into the Meuse-Argonne offensive. The year the doughboys went into the trenches in numbers, that finally shifted the balance. The year the war that was supposed to have ended years earlier finally ended. This rifle had been made in 1918. It had been carried somewhere, and then it had been in her garden. The gap between those two facts was 100 years of questions she didn't have answers to yet. She looked at the rifle for a long time. Then she added one line to the notebook. At the bottom of the first page of observations, someone brought this back. Someone carried it home from somewhere and put it in the ground. This was not an accident. This was a decision. What decision? She closed the notebook, made a third coffee. This one she drank. The decision to take it to Precision Arms was practical, sensible. The decision of a woman who was honest with herself about what she was and what she wasn't anymore. She was 78. Her hands worked, but they worked differently than they used to. The arthritis in her right index finger and the two adjacent knuckles was manageable. Had been manageable for 6 years, which meant she'd developed the workarounds and compensations and modified approaches that turned a liability into a negotiation. She knew her hands. She knew what she could ask of them. But a restoration of this complexity would take weeks, would require sustained physical effort over many hours, many days, would require the kind of endurance that she wasn't certain she still possessed, not because she doubted her skill, but because she was honest about the difference between possessing a skill and being physically capable of executing it for 8 hours at a stretch. And then there was the workshop, closed for 5 years. She hadn't opened it since the week after Thomas's funeral. Hadn't been able to, and she'd stopped interrogating that inability after the first year because the interrogation wasn't productive. And the result was always the same anyway. The workshop was where he used to come, pull up his stool, sit in the specific companionable silence they developed over 4 decades of her working and him watching, and she'd never needed him to do anything other than be there. And now he wasn't there, and the room had his absence in it in a way that the rest of the house had gradually lost. So practical, sensible. There was a gunsmith in town. She'd passed the place 100 times without ever going in. Precision Arms. On the main street, a young man named Tyler Brennan who'd taken over from his father a few years back. She didn't know him, didn't need to know him. She needed a professional assessment and a reasonable conversation about options. She wrapped the rifle in Thomas's old flannel shirt, the dark blue one that still lived in the hall closet for weeks she'd stopped examining. One of those objects that grief makes untouchable for a while, and then just leaves where it is, and set it on the passenger seat of the pickup, drove the 14 miles into town with the radio off. The September morning had gone fully golden by then, the valley doing its thing, the Blue Ridge sitting on the horizon the way it always sat. Permanent, unconcerned, the mountains that had been watching this particular stretch Virginia longer than anyone had been keeping records, and that would be watching it long after everyone currently alive had stopped. She parked in front of Precision Arms, sat in the truck for a moment, looked at the flannel bundle on the seat beside her. Just a shop, she told herself. Just a conversation. She got out, picked up the bundle, went in. The bell above the door was the aggressive kind, the kind that doesn't ask whether you want announcing. It announces regardless, loud, immediate, the conversational equivalent of someone grabbing your arm and pointing. Tyler Brennan looked up from behind the counter. He was younger than she'd expected, though she hadn't expected much specifically. 29, maybe 30. Dark hair, the kind of jaw that photographed well, the particular confidence in the set of his shoulders that comes from being good at something in a small pond and knowing it. He was helping another customer, a man in his late 20s wearing a tactical vest with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently gotten very interested in a hobby and hadn't yet discovered the difference between equipment and experience. Tyler glanced at Meredith. One glance, half a second. The kind of assessment that categorizes and files and moves on. She knew that glance. Had been receiving versions of it for 50 years, in shops, in meetings, in the classified corridors of buildings that didn't officially exist. The glance that said, woman, older. Not the primary demographic, nothing urgent here. He went back to the tactical vest customer. Meredith waited. She was good at waiting. Waiting was a skill she'd developed early and refined over 43 years of work that required it constantly. Waiting for processes to complete, for compounds to cure, for metal to respond to treatment at its own pace rather than yours. Impatience was expensive in her work. Impatience broke things, skipped steps, introduced errors that cost 10 times as much to correct as they would have cost to avoid. She stood near the counter and looked at the shop while Tyler finished his transaction. The tactical rifles in the cases, the accessories on the wall displays, the particular commercial cleanliness of a working gun shop. Not sterile, but organized in the way that businesses organize themselves when they want to appear competent, which Precision Arms did competently enough, modern, functional, the kind of place that knew its customer base and served it well. The tactical vest customer left with a bag and a handshake. Tyler turned to her. "Help you, I hope so." She set the flannel bundle on the counter, began unwrapping it, careful, unhurried. The way you reveal something when you know what it is and you're not embarrassed by its condition, because condition is information, and information is the beginning of everything. Tyler looked at it. She counted, because she had always counted, because numbers were honest. 1 second. The overall shape. 2 seconds. The surface rust. 3 seconds. The missing stock. 4 seconds. Some internal calculation completing, a verdict forming, ma'am. He leaned back slightly. The body language of someone creating distance from a problem they've already decided isn't their problem. "I'm going to be straight with you. Here it comes. This is beyond saving." He said it with the practiced efficiency of someone who had delivered this particular verdict before and had refined it into something almost kind. The clean cut rather than the slow one. The rust goes all the way through on something like that. Even if it didn't, and it does, you've got no stock. You've probably got missing small parts. And you're looking at a rifle that's been in the ground for what, 50 years? More? Probably closer to 100, she said. He looked at her, which is actually why it's worth saving, she said. "Ma'am," a small adjustment of his expression. Patience deployed as a professional tool. The specific patience of someone being polite at the cost of effort, which was different from actual patience, which was something you either had or developed over decades. Even if the metal wasn't completely compromised, and I'm telling you, it is. A proper restoration on something like this would take weeks, maybe months. You're talking about parts that haven't been manufactured in a century. A stock that doesn't exist anymore. He paused, assembled the conclusion, delivered it with what he probably thought was kindness. "My honest advice? Don't waste your money. And don't waste your time." He pushed the flannel bundle back toward her gently, carefully, not dismissive in his hands, only in every other possible way. "What about electrolytic reduction?" she said. "I'm sorry for the rust removal. Set up a proper electrolysis bath, washing soda solution, the right DC current, the right duration. You'd be surprised what the metal looks like underneath. The corrosion layer on something like this often acts as a protective barrier over the base steel, particularly with the alloys Springfield was using in 1918. Something crossed his face. A flicker of something she'd seen before. The specific expression of a person who has been on the receiving end of unexpected technical vocabulary. From a source they'd categorized as non-technical. "Ma'am, that's..." He started to say not how this works. She could see the sentence assembling itself behind his eyes. Then it changed. "That's a very involved process. And even if you manage to clean the metal, you're still looking at the stock problem. The parts problem. The stock, yes. I heard you." She folded one corner of the flannel back over the receiver. "Neat. Precise. The rifling might still be sound. Springfield was using good steel in 1918. The receiver geometry. Look," he said it, with the finality of a man closing a door. Professionally, without malice, but finally, completely, in a way that wasn't open to further discussion. I understand that you found something interesting, and you want it to be more than it is. That happens. People find things, and they hope. He paused, found the last piece of what he wanted to say, set it down like an offering. But restoration work like this, even if it were possible, which it isn't, it's above your pay grade. I'm sorry, silence. The shop radio played something soft and irrelevant in the back room. Meredith looked at him. He looked at her. She thought of several things she could say. She ran through them with the efficiency of someone who had spent 43 years in rooms where saying the wrong thing had consequences. She considered and discarded. Considered and discarded. Thank you for your time, she said. She finished wrapping the rifle, picked it up, walked out. The bell announced her departure with the same aggressive enthusiasm it had announced her arrival. It didn't know the difference. She sat in the truck for 11 minutes. She knew it was 11 minutes because she watched the clock on the dashboard. The digital one Thomas has installed in 1994 as part of a brief period when he'd been interested in upgrading the truck's features, a project that had stalled after the clock and never resumed, leaving the truck with one modern element surrounded by everything original. The clock had never been fully accurate. It ran about 3 minutes fast, which she'd accounted for so long that she no longer thought of it as wrong. Jack had waited differently. 11:14 became 11:25. She looked at the flannel bundle on the passenger seat, then at her hands on the steering wheel. The spot had appeared sometime in her 60s, and that she'd made a conscious decision to regard as interesting, rather than troubling. The swollen knuckle on the right index finger, the one that had been negotiating its position since 2018, the slight tremor that had started around year 3 after Thomas died and that she had decided was fatigue and would keep deciding was fatigue because the alternative explanations were not ones she was interested in entertaining. Above your pay grade, she sat with that for a moment. Above your pay grade, she thought of a letter from the Smithsonian. 2009. Dear Ms. Voss, it is with the deepest appreciation that the institution acknowledges the extraordinary restoration work you provided. The letter that lived in a box in the attic with 43 years of other things she'd never shown anyone. The commendations, the classified citations, the photographs from rooms that didn't officially exist, the records of work that had never been publicly attributed and never would be, above your pay grade. She thought about 1987. Fort Belvoir. The general, not one specific general. There have been several over the years who shook her hand in rooms without public addresses, but the one who had said, in the specific tone of someone who meant it and rarely said things he didn't mean. What you do here matters more than most people in this country will ever understand. And I mean that without any of the usual qualification. She had thanked him, gone back to work, never mentioned it to anyone. Above your pay grade, she thought about the Smithsonian collection, the presidential sidearms, the museum pieces that now lived behind glass in buildings most Americans had visited on school trips without knowing the name of the person who had given them back their truth. She had never needed that, had never wanted it. The work was enough. The work had always been enough. But she sat in the truck outside Precision Arms on a Tuesday morning in September and felt some shift in her chest that was not grief and not anger and not wounded pride. Something older than all of those. Something that had been sitting quietly under the retirement and the garden and the black coffee and the 5 years of closed workshop doors, waiting for exactly this kind of provocation. She started the truck, 14 miles back, the same road, the same mountains on the horizon, the same gate that squealed, and the same key. She parked in front of the farmhouse, sat for one more moment. Then she got out, carried the flannel bundle around the back of the house, and stood in front of the workshop door. The padlock, the weathered wood, the gap at the bottom where the draft came through in winter, and that she had decided long ago was a feature rather than a flaw. because you could feel the seasons changing through it, which was worth something. She stood there for a long time, longer than she'd expected to stand there. You don't have to do this today, she thought. Clearly, honestly. The thought of a woman who is not performing courage for an audience, but conducting a genuine internal assessment. Then she reached for the padlock, took it off, plived the door open. The smell hit her first, linseed oil and metal and wood shavings and thyme. The specific atmosphere of a place where precise things had been done over many years, where the air itself had absorbed the work like a record of it, where you could close your eyes and know exactly kind of room you were in and what kind of person had worked there. She stood in the doorway, did to go in immediately. Let herself stand at the threshold and look, the way she'd always looked before, touching, with patience, with full attention, letting the information come to her before she moved toward it. Dust motes in the light from the small windows. Thick, swirling in the disturbance of the door, opening, catching the September light, and making something briefly visible that had been invisible a moment before. Everything was still there. Of course it was. She'd known it would be. But knowing and seeing were different things, and seeing it now, after 5 years. After all the mornings, she'd walked past this door and kept walking. Produced something she hadn't anticipated. Not grief exactly. Something more complicated. Something that contained grief the way a river contains the rain. Not as a separate thing, but as a component of something larger and ongoing. The tools on their racks. Everyone in its exact designated position. The same positions as she'd established when she'd designed the storage light system in 1987. Positions that meant she could reach for anything in complete darkness. And her hand would find it without searching. She had installed that system and maintained it and used it for 30 years. And then left at it, and it waited with the patience of things that don't have a choice. And here it was, exactly as she'd left it. Every tool in its place. The benches. Solid oak 3 inches thick, bolted to the walls so they couldn't shift under the pressure of heavy work. Thomas had helped her build them in 1989. A project that had taken 2 weekends and produced 2 benches and 1 mild argument about the correct way to secure a bolt that had ended with her being right and him acknowledging it with the good grace he'd always managed in those moments. The machines under their canvas covers, the DC power supply for the electrolysis bath on its shelf, so the bottles of chemicals and compounds with their faded labels, still readable to eyes that had read them 10,000 times. She walked in slowly, let her fingers trail along the edge of the main workbench. The wood was exactly as she remembered, smooth where 30 years of hands had smoothed it, marked with the evidence of decades of careful work, stained with compounds and oils, and the residue of precision. The bench knew her hands, or her hands knew the bench. She had never been sure which way to think about it. On the wall above the bench, not an award. The awards and commendations and classified citations were in boxes in the attic, where she'd put them the week after retirement because they were for other people's benefit, and she'd never been interested in having her work be for other people's benefit. They were records. Important records, perhaps, but records, not the thing itself. What was on the wall above the bench was a piece of paper, small, yellowed. Taped up so long the tape had fused with the paint, become part of the wall rather than attached to it. Handwriting she recognized the way she recognized everything, fundamentally his. Immediately, before conscious processing, in the part of the brain that keeps the things that matter most closest to the surface. Thomas. The best work is the work nobody sees. He'd written it on a Tuesday in 1998. She'd come home from work frustrated. A project she couldn't discuss, a problem she couldn't describe. The specific tension of carrying difficulty in silence, because silence was required. And she'd said something half-articulate about the nature of invisible work. And he'd listened with the complete attention he always gave. And then he'd written it down on a piece of paper and taped it to the wall above her bench without ceremony or explanation, because he was the kind of man who expressed things by doing them, rather than by announcing them. She had looked at it every day for the next 14 years. She looked at it now. The flannel bundle was still in her hands. She didn't remember picking it back up after she opened the door, but here it was. She set it down on the bench, the workbench, where things got fixed, where things got restored, where things that had been broken or damaged or neglected or forgotten got brought back to what they were supposed to be, through patience and skill and the willingness to keep working past the point where most people would have stopped. She pulled Thomas's stool out from under the bench, the canvas one he'd used when he came to sit and watch, set it where it always went, sat down, looked at the rusted rifle on the bench in front of her, thought about the young man at the counter who had looked at it for 4 seconds and reached a conclusion, thought about the handwriting on the yellowed paper above her, thought about the rifle sitting in the earth for 100 years, waiting, not knowing it was waiting, not knowing anything, just existing in the dark and the clay, while wars ended and soldiers came home and decades passed, and an old woman expanded her garden one morning in September. She opened the cabinet under the bench. Her magnifying glasses were where she'd left them, the good ones. The ones with the precision optical correction she'd had made in 2011, when she'd finally acknowledged that her eyes, like everything else, had their own negotiations to conduct. The ones, Noelle said, made her look like a jeweler from another century. Meredith had always taken that as a compliment. She put them on, pulled the work lamp down on its articulating arm. The lamp she'd installed in 1994, the one that gave the specific quality of light that let her see what she needed to see. Bright without glare, directed without shadow, the kind of light that told the truth about surfaces. She clicked it on. Good light. She unwrapped the Springfield, and she looked. 2 hours she looked, just looked. No tools, no probes or picks or measuring instruments, just eyes and experience and the accumulated knowledge of 43 years of looking at metal and learning to understand what it was telling you, which was different from what it appeared to be telling you, which was different again from what an untrained eye would see. What it told her. The corrosion was severe, undeniably severe. Anyone with functioning eyes could see that, but corrosion was not the same thing as destruction, and this was the distinction that separated the educated assessment from the casual one. Rust, iron oxide, forms when steel meets oxygen and moisture over time. It creates a layer. It looks devastating. It looks final. But in high-quality firearms steel, particularly the steel that Springfield Armory was using in 1918, steel with specific carbon content, specific hardness, specific properties that reflected what was then the best American military metallurgy. That corrosion layer frequently acts as something between armor and steel. Ugly, alarming to the uninformed eye. But in many cases, underneath it, the base steel had been protected rather than consumed. The question was always what lay underneath. And the only way to answer that question was to go underneath. She cleaned another small section, more carefully this time. A slightly larger area, on the receiver flat, where she could get a better reading of the underlying surface condition. The steel was sound, not pristine, not untouched, but sound, intact, with structure, with the surface geometry it should have. The machining marks from Springfield Armory, stamped into this metal by machines operated by workers who believed in their work, were still legible. Still there. She leaned closer. The serial number she'd partially cleaned in the kitchen, now fully visible, 448312. She wrote it in the notebook again, larger this time, underlined it once. Then she sat back and looked at the ceiling of the workshop, the old barn ceiling, the heavy beams her grandfather had put up, the ceiling that Thomas used to look at when he was thinking about something, and she asked the question she'd been asking since the garden, "Who are you?" She was asking the rifle, which was not a strange thing to ask. Objects carry history. Objects carry identity. She had spent 43 years understanding that the most important information a firearm contained was not in its mechanism, but in its story. Who had made it, who had carried it, what it had witnessed, what had been asked of it, and whether it had answered. And this one had a story. She just didn't know it yet. She covered the rifle with a clean cloth, turned off the lamp, stewed in the workshop for a moment in the last of the September light. It was different in here than it had been. Something had changed in the air of the place, or in her. Something that felt less like absence and more like presence. Like the room had been waiting for the same thing she'd been waiting for, and they'd both been waiting for the same thing without knowing it was each other. Tomorrow, she would start the electrolysis fifth. Tomorrow, she would begin finding out what was underneath. Tonight, she would go back to the house, sit in Thomas's chair, let the radio play something with strings, sleep the sleep of someone who had, after 5 years of standing outside a door, finally gone through it. She turned off the light, walked back to the house in the September dark. The valley was doing its night thing around her, the particular quiet of 30 acres and no near neighbors, and the sounds that exist when human sound stops. Crickets still, this time of year, the oak settling. The gate, not squealing because there was no wind. She didn't look back at the workshop. She didn't need to. It would be there in the morning, and so would she. Day 2 began at 4:47 in the morning, not because she set an alarm. She hadn't set an alarm in 11 years, hadn't needed one, her body having made its own arrangements sometime in the decade after 60. A quiet internal renegotiation in which sleep became something you did until the work called you back, and the work, apparently, called it 4:47. She didn't bother with the garden clothes this time. Went straight to the workshop in her robe and the boots she'd left by the back door, laced but loose, which was not a combination she would have recommended to anyone, but which served its purpose entirely well at 4:47 in the morning when no one was watching, and the only opinion that mattered was the rifle's, and the rifle didn't care what she was wearing. The workshop was cold. September cold, the particular chill of a space that holds the night longer than the outside does, that keeps the dark temperature after the outside has started warming. A cold that was dense rather than sharp, the kind that settles into your joints if you stand still too long. She turned on the space heater in the corner, the old orange ceramic one that hummed at a frequency she'd long since stopped registering consciously. The way you stop registering the sound of a refrigerator or a clock, it becomes part of the room's baseline, beneath notice. She clicked on the work lamp. The light fell on the clean cloth she'd laid over the rifle the night before. She pulled the cloth off. Good morning. The electrolysis bath took 2 hours to set up properly. This was not a process that rewarded impatience. She had learned that in 1974, in her 5th year of work. When she'd rushed to set up on a project she was on, and introduced errors in the current density that had taken 3 days to diagnose and correct. She had not rushed an electrolysis setup since. The lesson had been expensive enough to be permanent. The tank itself, a heavy plastic container, 30 gallons, that had been sitting on the lower shelf since the last time she'd used it, in 2014, needed cleaning first. Decade-old residue from the previous batch, the faint mineral deposits left behind by washing soda solution that had done its work and dried. She cleaned it with care, dried it thoroughly, because contamination in the bath produced unpredictable results, and unpredictable results were expensive. Then the solution, washing soda, sodium carbonate, not baking soda, a distinction that mattered enormously, and that she had seen confused by people who should have known better, dissolved in water, at the correct ratio. Too concentrated, and you risk damaging the base metal. Too dilute and the process becomes inefficient, requiring longer exposure times that increased the risk of uneven treatment. She had mixed this solution hundreds of times. Her hands did it from memory while her mind ran the morning's plan. Then the electrodes, the copper ones, she'd made herself in 1997, Working from specifications she'd developed through several years of trial and the occasional instructive mistake. Copper made better anodes than steel in most applications, more consistent, more controllable, easier to replace when they inevitably degraded. She'd made 6 sets over the years. These were the last pair, then the DC power supply. The small unit Thomas had helped her mount on the shelf in 2003. She remembered the afternoon specifically. A Saturday in October, cold enough that they'd both been in jackets. Him holding the unit in place against the shelf bracket while she drove the mounting bolts, his hands steadier than hers. For once, because she'd been fighting a minor infection that week. And everything had been slightly off. She'd done the electrical connections herself afterward while he made lunch. She tested the unit before connecting anything. Always tested first. Always the readout was accurate. Current adjustable across the range she needed. The unit had sat unused for 10 years, worked as well as the day they'd mounted it, which was a testament to something. Quality of manufacture, perhaps, or simply the reliability of things that are built without corners cut, which was a category she'd spent her career thinking about. Good. She began disassembling the rifle. This was the first real moment of physical contact. Everything before had been observation. The eyes work, the mind's work. This was the beginning of the hands' work. The beginning of the actual conversation between herself and the object. Her hands moved over the corroded metal, with a slowness that was not hesitation. Deliberation. The specific quality of movement that comes from knowing exactly what you're doing and respecting the process enough not to rush it. The arthritis in her right index finger and the adjacent knuckle required her to adjust her grip on certain tools, redistribute the pressure, find the angle that placed the load on the joints that had fewer opinions. She had developed these adjustments over 6 years. They were automatic now. Compensation engineered into technique. Compensation was not weakness. Compensation was the intelligence of someone who understood their materials, including themselves. The receiver came free first, seized by corrosion but yielding, slowly, to penetrating oil she'd applied the previous night, and the careful incremental pressure of tools chosen for their specific leverage ratios. Then the barrel, more seized, requiring more patience, more oil. More of the particular stillness that precision work demanded. Then the bolt assembly, the most seized of all. A century of oxidation had fused components that were designed to move freely into something that resembled a single, solid piece. She left it soaking in penetrating oil and moved to the other components, because some problems required time as part of their solution, and fighting time was always more expensive than using it. She cataloged each piece as it came free, notebook open beside her, pencil moving. The same handwriting she'd used for 43 years, slightly larger now because the eyes made certain accommodations, and there was no shame in accommodation. What she had: receiver, barrel, bolt assembly, partially seized, soaking. Trigger group, corroded but present, all components accounted for. Floor plate and magazine assembly, damaged but intact. Small pins and screws, mostly present. 2 unaccounted for, possibly still in the garden soil, possibly lost to a century of circumstances that she would never reconstruct. What she did not have: stock. Rear sight assembly, original sling hardware, she wrote, more present than absent. Favorable, and meant it precisely. In her experience, most objects that appeared to be total losses were, on examination, more present than absent. The appearance of loss was usually surface. The reality underneath was usually better than the surface suggested. This was true of objects, and she suspected it was true of other things as well. Though she was a gunsmith rather than a philosopher and she tried to stay in her lane, the components went into the bath in sequence: receiver first, submerged in the washing soda solution, connected to the cathode, the negative terminal, with a copper clip she'd made specifically for this purpose, shaped to grip the receiver without damaging the surface she was trying to recover. The sacrificial anode, a piece of scrap mild steel she kept in a bin specifically for this purpose, because the anode degraded during the process and needed to be replaceable, connected to the positive terminal. Current adjusted. She watched the readout, made a small correction, watched again. The first bubbles appeared, tiny, rising from the surface of the receiver, where the electrical current was initiating the chemistry. She watched them form and rise and break at the surface, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a process, beginning that she'd initiated hundreds of times, and that still, after all those times, felt like something worth paying attention to. What was happening was this: the direct current flowing through the solution was driving a chemical reaction at the surface of the steel. The oxygen atoms in the iron oxide, the rust, were being separated from the iron atoms beneath them, driven off, not scraped, not abraded, not attacked with chemicals that might damage the underlying metal. Electrically persuaded to leave. Rust, politely but firmly and with the authority of physics, to give back what it had taken. She had always found this process almost philosophical. You didn't attack the rust, you didn't fight it. You created the conditions, the right solution, the right current, the right duration, under which the rust chose to leave. Patient, indirect, working with the nature of things rather than against them. Thomas had watched her set up this bath once, years ago. Some late-night project she'd brought home. Something she could work on here rather than in the facility. He'd stood at the edge of the tank with his arms crossed and his reading glass pushed up on his forehead, watching the bubbles. So you're just reversing time? In a very small, very specific way. Yes. He'd nodded slowly, the thoughtful nod, the one that meant he was turning something over. That's a remarkable thing to know how to do. She'd told him any decent chemist could explain the process. The chemistry wasn't remarkable. The chemistry was just chemistry. He'd looked at her for a moment. "I'm not talking about the chemistry," he'd said. She hadn't fully understood what he meant. Not then. She'd been busy, focused on the work, the way she always was when she was in the middle of something. She understood it now. Standing alone in the workshop at 5:30 in the morning, watching the receiver of 1918 Springfield sit in a bath that was slowly, patiently, systematically reversing what a century of Earth had done to it. She understood it now. The bolt assembly took most of the morning to free. The penetrating oil she'd applied the previous night had been part of the work, softening the oxidized bonds between components, reducing the grip of a century of chemistry. But the rust had formed genuine bonds, not surface corrosion but structural oxidation, the kind that worked its way into the gaps between parts, and dried and hardened and become, in its own way, part of the mechanism it had invaded. She worked with heat. Careful. Controlled heat from the small torch. Not enough to damage the metal, which required understanding the thermal properties of the specific alloy she was working with and the temperature tolerances of the components, which she did. Enough heat to expand the metal fractionally, to break the adhesion of the rust at the molecular level, to give the penetrating oil the access it needed, and pressure, deliberate, incremental. The kind of pressure that moves things by asking them repeatedly, rather than demanding them all at once. The kind that feels like nothing happening and then suddenly, everything happening. Not force. Force breaks things. Force is what you use when you don't understand what you're working with or don't care about the result. Force is impatience with consequences. Preposition frees things. The bolt finally came apart in 3 careful movements, the first 2 setting up the third completing what the first 2 had prepared. The sound it made was the sound of something that had been locked in place for a century suddenly being released. Not dramatic, not loud, just the quiet acknowledgement of a long stasis ending. She set the components out on the cloth, examined each one, the bolt body, the firing pin, the long slender rod, whose condition would tell her a great deal about what this rifle had and hadn't done. The extractor, the ejector, all present, all corroded. All And this was the thing that made her stop and bring the magnifying glass close and look again, all showing significantly less internal damage than the exterior corrosion had suggested. She made the note with the care of someone who understood what it might mean. Interior corrosion significantly less than exterior. Components protected by sealed state. Firing pin, intact, likely salvageable. Extractor, requires full assessment. Ejector, promising. She checked the clock, clocked 22. She had not eaten breakfast. She considered this information briefly and concluded it was not yet actionable. By early afternoon, the receiver had been in the bath for 6 hours. She pulled it out. Non-metallic tongs. Metal tongs could introduce galvanic complications. Another lesson from 1974. Set it on the clean cloth she'd prepared, and looked. The transformation was not complete. The bath would need to run with several more cycles before the corrosion was fully addressed. But what was visible now was dramatic. Require a moment of stillness. The orange-brown surface she'd pulled from her garden was gone from large sections of the receiver. In its place, steel. Dark, clean, the gray-silver of actual metal rather than iron oxide. The surface of a thing rather than the surface of what had been done to it. She brought the magnifying glass close, the machining marks. Still there. 100 years in the ground, and the machining marks left by the workers at Springfield Armory, the men and women. Because in 1918, it had been both. At the Springfield Armory, assembling rifles for a war, were still legible. The care with which this receiver had been machined in 1918 had survived a century of clay soil and oxidation and emerged intact, waiting to be read. She leaned closer. The serial number, now fully visible. 448312. She wrote it in the notebook, larger than before. Underlined it twice this time. Then she sat back on the stool and looked at the ceiling. The old barn ceiling, the heavy beams, the ceiling Thomas used to look at when he was thinking. And she asked the question she'd been asking since the garden. Who are you? And this time she thought she might know how to find out. She called Marcus Webb at 3 in the afternoon. She'd been thinking about calling him since the previous evening, running the calculation, whether the serial number was enough to work with, whether the record would have survived, whether the chain of military records archiving was complete for 1918 manufacture. She'd concluded yes to all three and picked up the phone. Marcus was 22 years old and had spent 32 years with the National Archives Military Records Division before retiring to Charlottesville, which was close enough that they'd stayed in occasional contact over the years. He had the voice of a reference librarian, precise, slightly formal, as if he were reading from a card catalog, even in casual conversation, which she found reassuring because it matched the way she thought about information. Organized, categorical, retrievable. He picked up on the second ring. Meredith Voss, he said. I was wondering when you'd call, which was not something she'd expected. You were expecting me? There's been some activity on the military records portal. Serial number queries for 1918 Springfield still production. I keep an eye on those. Old habit. Yours is the only name that came to mind. A pause, the sound of him settling into his chair. What did you find? 448312, the sound of a keyboard. Brief, that's a 1918 manufacture, he said. April production run, based on the serial range. You knew that. I knew that. Springfield Armory. Shipped in the April 1918 lot. More keyboard sounds. The particular cadence of someone who knew a database well enough to move through it without thinking about the navigation. Part of a shipment to the 116th Infantry Regiment. Virginia National Guard, she set her coffee down, the 116th Infantry, Virginia National Guard. The regiment that had trained in this valley, in the geography she'd been looking at every morning for 40 years. The regiment that had gone to France as part of the 29th Division in 1918 in the final push of the war. Which unit? She asked. Give me a moment. The sound of him going deeper into the record. Company K, assigned to a soldier from Augusta County. He paused. Private Clarence Aldridge, Augusta County, Virginia. Inducted January 1918. Deployed with the 29th Division, April 1918, Augusta County. She looked out the kitchen window at the workshop, at the 30 acres beyond it, at the line of the Blue Ridge on the horizon. Augusta County was right there, the same county, the same geography. Clarence Aldridge had grown up, looking at the same mountains she'd been looking at for 40 years, and he had taken this rifle across an ocean and come back. Or not come back, and the rifle had ended up in her garden. "What happened to him?" she asked, the sound of Marcus consulting something. A longer pause this time, the pause of someone reading carefully. "That's where it gets interesting," he said. Not with drama. Marcus didn't do drama, but with the specific inflection of a man who had spent 32 years in military records and had learned to recognize when a record contained something worth noting. Aldridge is listed as returned, mustered out in November 1919. He came home, Meredith, but the rifle is not in the return inventory. Another pause. The record shows the rifle as unaccounted for at mustering out, which the Army recorded as lost in field, and which almost certainly means one of several things. He waited, the way he always waited, giving her the space to think through the options herself before he listed them. He kept it, she said. He wouldn't be the first. A lot of soldiers came home with things that weren't strictly theirs to keep. The Army mostly looked the other way. The logistics of recovering every piece of equipment from every returning soldier were impossible. And there was the general sense that men who'd survived the Maizuz Argonne had earned certain accommodations. She looked out the window. Clarence Aldridge, 19 years old in 1918. Approximately, boys from Augusta County got inducted young that year, the Army taking what it could get. He had shipped out in April, had gone to France with the 29th Division, had been part of the American force that finally broke the German lines in the autumn of 1918 and ended the war that had consumed 4 years and 20 million lives. And he had come home with a rifle that wasn't his to keep, and he, or someone later, for reasons she might never know, had buried it in the ground on property that would, eventually, become hers. "The property?" she asked. "Can you tell me anything about where he lived, whether the farm was near?" "Property records from that era in Augusta County exist, but they're not digitized," Marcus said. "You'd need to go to the courthouse. The physical records are there, I'd expect, but it would take time." "I know," she said. Meredith, a pause. The pause of someone who had something to say that wasn't part of the official information. "What are you going to do with it?" She looked at the workshop through the window, at the lamp she'd left on inside, the light falling on the bench, where the rifle components were laid out in sequence on the clean cloth. "What I've always done," she said. A brief silence. "Good," said Marcus Webb, and she could hear, in the single word, everything he wasn't saying, the version of this answer he'd clearly been hoping for. She hung up, finished her coffee, went back to work. Clarence Aldridge. She thought about him as she worked through the afternoon, through the second cycle of the bath, through the careful cleaning of the bolt components with the fine brass brushes she used for this kind of work, through the detailed examination of the trigger group that confirmed what the exterior had only suggested, that the internal components were in significantly better condition than any reasonable person would have expected. She thought about him without sentimentality, but with the specific attention she gave to the history of every object she restored. History was not decoration. History was information. The story of how an object had gotten to its present state was essential to understanding what the present state actually meant, what the corrosion patterns indicated, what the wear distribution suggested, what the condition of certain components relative to others implied about use and storage, and the particular circumstances of a life. Private Clarence Aldridge, 19 years old, Augusta County. January 1918. Induction, April 1918. Deployment, November 1919 return, 20 months, roughly, from induction to mustering out, with a rifle that wasn't his to keep. She ran the borescope through the barrel that afternoon. The borescope, a slender optical instrument she'd been using since 1995, updated twice as the technology improved, that let her examine the interior of a barrel without any disassembly. Connected to the small screen she'd used since 2007. She fed it carefully into the muzzle, made the adjustments, looked at the screen. She went very still. The rifling was intact, not just present, intact. The spiral grooves that gave a bullet its spin, that were the engineering difference between a weapon that was accurate and a length of pipe that happened to be round, were sharp, well-defined. The lands, the raised sections between the grooves, still showing clean, clear edges. She ran the calculation in her head. The degree of rifling wear she was seeing corresponded to, at most, a few dozen rounds fired through this barrel, possibly fewer. For a rifle manufactured in 1918 and shipped to France with a soldier who served through the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the bloodiest engagement in American military history, 26,000 American soldier killed in 6 weeks. This was extraordinary, inexplicable, almost, unless Clarence Aldridge hadn't fired it. She made the note carefully. Minimal wear and rifling. Inconsistent with combat use. Possible explanations. 1. Soldier did not enter combat before armistice, November 1918. 2. Rifle was replaced in field before significant use. 3. Soldier kept rifle without firing at it. For something else entirely. She stared at option 4 for a moment. Then she looked at the barrel. Clean now, the steel revealed. The rifling sharp, after a century underground. And she thought about a 19-year-old boy from Augusta County, standing somewhere in France with this rifle in his hands, and not using it, coming home, keeping the rifle, putting it in the ground. She would never know why. The record would never tell her, and the people who might have known were gone, and the particular truth of what had happened in France and why this rifle had come home unfired would remain in the permanent category of things that couldn't be recovered. But the rifle itself was here, and she could recover that. She set the borescope aside, picked up her pencil, a dead one more line to the observation notes. He brought it home. He kept it. He put it in the ground. Whatever he was burying, he wasn't done with it. Neither am I. Noel arrived on Saturday without calling first, which was its own kind of statement. Meredith heard the car in the gravel, the particular sound of Noel's practical sedan, the one she'd bought 3 years ago, after finally conceding that the car she'd driven for 11 years had stopped being a functional vehicle and become a philosophical commitment to not spending money, which was admirable in principle but inconvenient in practice. The sound of the gravel under those specific tires was different from the sound of the pickup's tires, different from the sound of any other vehicle that came down the path, and she knew it the way she knew all the sounds of her 30 acres. Automatically, without having to think about it, she did not go out to meet her. Not because she was unwelcoming, because her hands were in the middle of the barrel assessment, at a point that required sustained attention, and the car would stop, and Noel would get out, and Noel would come to where she was, which was the natural order of things. Noel had grown up coming to wherever Meredith was. It was not a statement. It was just how they operated. The workshop door opened. Noel stood in it, 49 years old. Dark-haired, the dark hair that had come from Thomas's side of the family, now threaded with gray at the temples in the way that looked on Noel. Distinguished rather than aged, the same slight downward tilt at the outer corners of the eyes that Thomas had had. The eyes that made both of them look, in certain lights, as if they were about to say something gentle. She was wearing the expression she wore when she'd rehearsed something in the car on the way over and wasn't sure how to begin it. She looked at the workshop, at the tanks, the tools, the lamp, the rifle components, laid out in careful sequence on the clean cloth, the The notebook open beside the bench. The smell of linseed oil and penetrating compound and metal, a smell that was completely foreign to everything Noelle associated with her mother's retirement. Mom, hand me that cloth, the lint-free one. Second shelf, left side. A pause that lasted long enough to contain several things Noelle was deciding not to say. Then she crossed the workshop and found the cloth on the second shelf. Left side sofa, because of course that was where it was. Everything in this room was exactly where it was, and handed it over. How long have you been out here? Since Wednesday, it's Saturday. I know what day it is, Noelle. Her daughter stood beside the bench and looked at the components laid out on the cloth. Meredith could feel the looking, the careful, systematic inventory of someone trying to assess a situation before deciding how to address it. Noelle had always done this. As a child, she'd been the one who watched before participating, who understood the room before she entered it. It had made her an excellent accountant and a sometimes exhausting daughter. Your hands are working. You have arthritis, I'm aware. I've been aware for 6 years, Mom. Dad would not want. Meredith set down the cloth, turned to look at her daughter fully. Noelle had her father's eyes. She had them right now, those gray-green eyes with the downward tilt, looking at Meredith with the expression of someone who is genuinely worried and had enough love to make the worry feel like pressure instead of comfort. Your father, Meredith said, spent 30 years sitting on that stool watching me work. He brought me coffee at 10 in the evening and again at midnight when I was in the middle of something. And he never once, not once, in 30 years, suggested that I stop. How was it different, Noelle? The specific quiet of a person preparing for an argument and not finding a good one. You were younger, she said finally. Quietly, yes. Meredith turned back to the barrel. And the work was harder, and the stakes were higher, and my hands were steadier. And I was still wrong sometimes, and had to start over from the beginning. She moved the lamp to get a better angle on the bore. Being younger doesn't make you right. It just makes you faster. And fast isn't always better. Silence in the workshop. Then Noelle sat down on Thomas's stool. Meredith registered this, without comment. She could see, from the corner of her eye, that Noelle had surprised herself, the way she looked at the stool for a moment before sitting, as if she'd moved without deciding to. As if the stool had some gravitational quality that pulled the people who loved Thomas toward it. How bad is it? Noelle asked, differently now. The rehearsed argument abandoned. The other voice, the one she used when she was asking something real. The rifle, honestly, externally, severe. More than I'd have expected to find survivable. Meredith moved the lamp again. Internally, significantly better than the exterior suggested. The rifling is intact. What does that mean? It means the barrel can still do what it was made to do. She looked up. The rifle is more present than absent. That's what matters. Noelle was quiet for a moment, looking at the receiver that had come out of the bath, the steel showing through the converted corrosion, the machining marks legible after a century underground. Can you fix it? She asked. I can restore it. What's the difference? Meredith looked at her daughter. Fixing is about function. Storing is about truth. She turned back to her work. Fixing makes it work again. Restoring makes it what it was. I'm not interested in making it work. I'm interested in making it true. Noelle sat with this. How do you know what it's supposed to be? She asked. You're making a stock from scratch, apparently. How do you know what it's supposed to look like? The same way you know anything you've done long enough. Meredith looked at the components on the cloth. You just know. The knowledge becomes part of you. Your hands know before your brain does, and your brain stopped questioning your hands somewhere around year 20. Was it always like that? Even at the beginning? At the beginning, I measured everything 3 times and was still wrong half the time. A pause. The knowing comes later. If you do the work honestly for long enough, eventually the knowing arrives. Becomes part of you. You can't separate it from yourself anymore. How long did it take? Meredith thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. 15 years to be competent, she said. 20 to be genuinely good. 30 to stop being conscious of the process. Around year 30, I stopped being able to tell you how I knew things. I just knew them. Noelle was quiet for a long time. Outside, the September afternoon was moving toward evening, the light through the small workshop windows going amber. The valley, settling into its evening register. I didn't know, Noelle said finally, softly, not accusatory, something more complicated than accusation. I knew you worked for the government. I knew it was classified. I knew there were things you couldn't tell me. She looked at the tools on the walls, the organized rows of them, but I didn't know what it actually was. What you actually were. Meredith set down the tool she was holding. You weren't supposed to, she said. I know. A pause. I'm not talking about the classified part. I'm talking about. She gestured at the room. At all of it. This. The level. I didn't know you were this. Meredith looked at her daughter, 49 years old. Thomas's eyes. A stubbornness that had arrived from somewhere, and that Meredith had always privately suspected she knew exactly where from. I'm your mother, she said. I was always this. You just didn't have a reason to see it before. Noelle stayed for an hour. She didn't help. Meredith asked her to, and she didn't offer. Both of them understanding without discussion that this was not a collaborative project. But she sat on the stool and asked questions that were increasingly specific and less tentative, and Meredith answered them with the patience she gave to genuine curiosity, which was different from the patience she gave to worry. When Noelle's phone buzzed, something from work, the particular urgency of a professional life that didn't observe weekends, she stood up, without making an issue of it, gathered her bag, touched Meredith's shoulder once briefly on her way out. Meredith felt the touch. Kept working. It was the morning of the third day of stock work. The day she was going to fit the barrel channel, the most demanding part of the fitting process, that she found the box. She'd been reaching past the lumber storage at the back of the workshop for a specific rasp she kept on the shelf behind it. A wide, flat rasp for the broad curved surfaces that needed material removed efficiently before the finishing work began. Her hand hit something else. A cardboard box, medium-sized, pushed to the back of the shelf behind the lumber pieces, pushed to the back of the shelf, the kind of placement that meant someone had put it there deliberately, rather than as temporary storage. Someone who wasn't her. She stood with the rasp in her hand and looked at the box. Then she set the rasp down, carried the box to the bench, set it under the lamp, looked at the side, Thomas's handwriting, just her name, Meredith. Nothing else. No explanation, no date, no indication of when it had been placed there, or what she was supposed to do with it, or whether she's supposed to find it now or later or when. Thomas had never explained things that he thought were self-explanatory. She opened the box. Books first. History books. 3 of them. The kind he'd brought her over the years from sales and auctions. And the occasional bookshop in town, chosen with the specific knowledge of a man who understood what his wife read and paid attention to the gaps. She recognized 2 of them as things she'd mentioned wanting. The third was one she didn't recognize, which meant he'd found it on his own, and decided she'd want it, which meant it was probably something she'd have wanted. She set them aside, photographs, a small stack of them, held together with a rubber band that had aged to brittleness and snapped when she removed it. She went through them slowly, the workshop, early days, the bench before everything was organized, the shelves still being populated, the system still being developed, and herself, younger by decades, in profile, bent over something at the bench. She didn't remember the photograph being taken. Thomas had taken it from the doorway, quietly enough that she hadn't heard him. He'd always known that announcing himself would change what he was trying to capture, so he'd learned not to announce. She looked at her own younger face, completely focused, entirely present. The particular quality of attention that the work required, and that she gave it without thinking, because the work was what she did, and she did it with everything she had. She set the photographs aside. At the bottom of the box, a notebook, small, soft cover, the kind from a drugstore, not her kind of notebook, not the leather-bound practical kind she used for work. This was personal, filled with Thomas's handwriting. The handwriting she recognized the way she recognized everything, essentially his. Before she'd consciously registered what she was seeing. She opened it. He had been keeping it for years. The entries were dated from 1998 through 2023. 25 years of occasional entries, not daily, not even weekly. Whenever something moved him enough to commit it to paper, which was Thomas's relationship with writing. He didn't do it casually. He did it when something mattered enough that he needed to hold it still. She read slowly. In no particular order, the way you read something when you're not sure how much of it you can bear to take in sequence. Entries about Noel, about the farm, about a summer vacation they'd taken in 2004 that she'd forgotten, and that he had apparently not forgotten at all, described in the kind of detail that meant something to him that she hadn't fully understood at the time. Small entries about small moments. The morning the creek flooded in 2011, a conversation at dinner. One night in 16 that she barely remembered, the particular quality of a winter afternoon when the snow had come in sideways, and both been in sideways, and they'd both watch, and she'd been reading, and he'd been watching out the window, been watching, always watch. And then the last entry, dated March 2023, 7 months before he died, though he hadn't known at the time of writing that he would die in October. The doctors hadn't told them until August, and even then the prognosis had been uncertain, had remained uncertain until it became certain in the particular irreversible way. His handwriting was smaller than the earlier entries, more deliberate, as if the pen moved more slowly, as if the writing cost more than it once had, or as if he was choosing every word rather than letting them come. I have been thinking about what Meredith builds. Not the specific things. I never knew the specific things, and I understood why, and I never needed to. The understanding was never the point. Being present was the point, but the fact of them. The fact that, for 43 years, she went to a place she couldn't tell me about, and did work she couldn't describe, and came home with her hands smelling like metal, and her eyes still partly elsewhere, still in the work, the way she always was. When something was unfinished, I used to watch her here, in the workshop. I would come out on evenings, and pull up the stool, and just be in the room with her. She never asked me to leave. I think she liked it. I know I did. I didn't understand most of what she was doing. I still don't, but I understood the doing of it, the way she approached every piece as if it deserved her full attention, the way she was never careless with anything, the way her hands moved. I knew watching her that whatever she was doing mattered. Not important the way the government had decided. It was important. I was sure it was important that way too, but that wasn't what I meant. Important in the older way, the craftsman way. The way that things done with full attention and genuine skill matter, whether or not anyone sees them. Whether or not anyone knows, she never let anyone see how extraordinary she is. Not even herself, I think. She just did the work for 43 years. And then she retired and she started the garden and she's been in the house, and I see her sometimes from the kitchen window looking at the workshop. I hope she opens it again, whatever is in there waiting for her, whatever she finds. I hope she knows she is still exactly who she always was. The retirement didn't change it. Nothing changes it. It's in her hands. I was watching the whole time. I want her to. It was enough. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Meredith sat on the workshop around her, the tools on the walls, the lamp over the bench, the half-shaped stock on the bench, the walnut showing the beginning of what it would become, the work interrupted by a cardboard box and a soft-covered notebook, and the handwriting of a man who had been watching the whole time. She had not cried at Thomas's funeral. She had stood in the cold November ground and received condolences from people who meant well, and said, things that were true and that she had no room for at the time. And she had held herself in the specific way she'd learned to hold herself in situations that required functioning over feeling. A skill she'd developed early in her career and maintained ever since. The skill of deferring what you couldn't process in the moment until you could. She had been deferring it for 5 years. She cried. She cried now, not dramatically, not loudly. The specific crying of someone who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally encountered the exact thing that makes holding it no longer possible. The one true thing that breaks through all the accommodation and the management and the practical functioning of grief. She let it happen. It took as long as it took. Then she set the notebook carefully back in the box. Set the box on the shelf where Thomas had left it, because that was where he'd put it, and she wasn't ready to move it anywhere else yet. She would move it eventually. Not today. Washed her hands at the workshop sink, sat back down on the stool, picked up the rasp, and went back to the stock because the work was there. And she was there. And Thomas had been watching for 43 years, and he had decided it was enough. So she would give him the end of it, the completion of something he'd watched her begin and hadn't lived to see finished. Not this specific rifle. He hadn't known about this rifle, but the work. The thing the work was. The thing her hands were and had always been. She would give him that. Day 7 cold bluing. This was where the work became something else. Where the technical crossed into the aesthetic, where precision became beauty. Not decorative beauty, not the beauty of ornamentation, but the beauty of a thing being exactly and completely what it was made to be. Hot tank bluing would have been faster. She didn't have a hot tank, hadn't maintained one since she'd stopped doing volume work in the government facilities, but she wouldn't have used it anyway. Hot tank bluing produced a consistent, clean, modern-looking finish, exactly right in the factory sense, and also unmistakably contemporary to any eye, trained enough to read a finish, which hers was, and Tyler Brennan's she suspected was not, cold bluing. Done by hand, done the traditional way. Applied with a clean cloth in thin layers, each layer allowed to complete its conversion before the next was applied. Built up with patience over many applications, produced something different, something that couldn't be replicated with speed or shortcuts. The deep, light-absorbing blue-black that Springfield Armory had put on military rifles in 1918, the color that seemed to pull light inward rather than reflect it outward, made the steel look like something substantial and serious and made to last. She mixed the bluing compound that morning. Her hands moved through the preparation from memory. The ratio, the temperature, the sequence. 43 years of this man had deposited it somewhere, deeper than conscious recall. In the hands themselves, in the muscle memory. That was the real archive of a craftsman's knowledge. She began with the receiver. Cloth, compound, stroke, even pressures across the full surface, not too much compound, not too little. The application that her hands knew was right without measuring. She watched the surface as she worked. Watched the steel begin its conversion, the blue-gray of the first layer appearing as the compound reacted with the metal. Let it sit. The exact right duration. Not longer. Neutralized. Dried. Second layer, the color deepened. Third layer. Fourth. The blue-black developing its characteristic depth, its quality of containing rather than reflecting light. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Receiver, then barrel, then the smaller components in sequence, each one given the same attention as the receiver. Each one receiving the same careful layering that the receiver had received. There were no unimportant components in a proper restoration. Every piece that would show mattered. Every piece that had survived 100 years deserved to be treated as if it intended to survive another 100. By late afternoon, the components were done. She laid them out under the lamp. Looked at them for a long time. The blue-black finish had the quality she'd been working toward. Dense, deep, the color of dark water at depth. The color that made you think of the workers at Springfield Armory in 1918 who had put this same compound on this same steel and sent it out into a war that would define a century. The finish that Clarence Aldridge had held when he carried this rifle across an ocean. The finish that had disappeared under a century of soil and oxidation. And that was now, through the patient application of chemistry and time, exactly as it had been. She began the final assembly, the stock first. 3 days of work, the careful shaping from the black walnut Thomas had bought in 2006 at an estate sale. The grain running straight out through the stock, what she'd sketched and cut and shaped by hand, with rasps and chisels and scrapers, the wood responding to her hands the way wood did when you understood its properties and worked with them rather than against them. The linseed oil finish she'd applied in 15 coats over 2 days. Each coat rubbed in by hand, the oil penetrating the wood fibers and sealing them. The finish that would protect this stock the way the original finish had protected it for the first decades of its life. The barrel bedded into the stock. She adjusted the contact points with the patience of someone who understood that the difference between correct and almost correct was the difference between accurate and inaccurate, between a rifle that did what it was designed to do and one that merely resembled it. The actions, the trigger group, fitted the bolt, cleaned and freed and treated, slid home. She worked the bolt. The sound was clean, the specific clean of a mechanism that had been fitted rather than assembled, that had been made to work together rather than simply made to work. The bolt cycling with precision that was audible, the announcement of things done right. She held the rifle, the assembled weight of it in her hands, the walnut warm under her fingers, the steel cool, the balance, which was correct. The 1903 Springfield had been designed with a balance that reflected decades of military rifle development, weight distributed to allow sustained accurate fire, and the balance she was feeling now was exactly that balance because she had built it to exactly those specifications. A rifle, a complete rifle. Not the rusted hulk she dug from clay with shaking hands on a Tuesday morning. Not the corroded mass that a 29-year-old had dismissed in 4 seconds without a single question. Not the thing she'd driven home in silence, thinking about her hands and the Smithsonian letter. And what above your pay grade actually meant, what it had been in 1918, what Clarence Aldridge had held, what it was supposed to be. She worked the bolt again. Click, clean, solid. The sound of something that intended to last. She set the rifle down on the bench, sat back on the stool, looked at it for a long time. And for the first time since Thomas had died, and the workshop had closed, and the mornings had become just coffee and garden, and the patient management of absence, for the first time in 5 years, she smiled. Not for anyone, not because something was coming, just because the work was done, and it was right, and that was, as it had always been, enough. She wrapped it in clean canvas. Not the flannel shirt. The flannel was Thomas, and she had used it to carry the rifle when it was broken and unresolved. And she wasn't ready to say what it was or what it might become. She wasn't going to use it now that the rifle was whole. That felt like a distinction worth making. Not sentimental, not symbolic in any way she needed to explain to anyone. Just correct in the way that certain decisions are correct, without requiring justification. The flannel was for carrying something uncertain. The canvas was for carrying something finished. She found the canvas in the workshop, the heavy-duty kind she used for protecting completed work during transport. Tightly woven, won't slip, won't leave fibers on a finished surface. She folded it around the Springfield, carefully tucked the ends, set it on the passenger seat of the pickup, sat behind the wheel. The morning was cool. October now, fully October. The valley committed to its autumn in the way the Shenandoah Valley committed to things. Completely and without apology. The old oak had gone amber at the tips, and the leaves were coming down in the particular way they came, down here, not all at once, but gradually, one decision at a time, until One morning, the tree would be bare, and the ground around it would be covered, and the whole transition would have happened so slowly that you'd missed exactly when it occurred. She looked at the canvas bundle on the seat. 8 days ago. This had been a corroded ruin that a 29-year-old had assessed in 4 seconds and concluded was beyond saving. 8 days ago, she had sat in this same truck in a parking lot for 11 minutes, looking at her own hands and thinking about a letter from the Smithsonian and a general in a room that didn't officially exist. 8 days. She thought about Clarence Aldridge from Augusta County, 19 years old, in 1918, who had carried this rifle across an ocean and come home with it and buried it in the earth of a county he'd grown up in. She thought about what he'd thought he was doing, ending something, perhaps, putting something away that he couldn't put away any other way, or keeping something close in the only way that felt safe, or private, or permanent. She would never know which. The record didn't say, and the people who might have known were gone. And the earth had kept his reason, the way it had kept the rifle. Some things stayed buried, some things came up. She started the truck. The truck coughed, once, then settled. She patted the dashboard in the way she'd patted that for 30 years. Not affection, exactly. More the acknowledgement of relation between two aging things that had kept their agreement with each other through a combination of stubbornness and maintenance, and the mutual understanding that neither of them had any better option. The blue ridge on the horizon, the gate squealing its single note, the gravel crunching 14 miles. She drove them without the radio. Main Street in Lexington on a Tuesday morning in October had the specific quality of small towns in good weather, unhurried, self-contained. The businesses open and the sidewalks populated with the people who had actual business here, rather than people passing through. A woman with a stroller. A man unlocking the hardware store with the methodical patience of someone who had been unlocking the same door for 20 years and expected to unlock it for 20 more. A dog tied it to a bench outside the shop demonstrating, with the resigned dignity of a dog who knew how this worked, that it would wait as long as necessary. She parked in front of Precision Arms. Looked at the shop for a moment through the windshield crepe shaped like Tennessee. Just a shop. She picked up the canvas bundle and went in. The bell announced her. Tyler Brennan was at the counter with the laptop open. The particular administrative posture of a small business owner, managing the parts of the job that weren't the interesting parts. He looked up. The automatic look, and she saw it happen. The categorization beginning. Woman, older, the filing starting. And then it changed. Recognition, the specific recognition of someone, placing a previous encounter and reassessing its significance. She could see it move across his face. The woman with the rusted rifle, 2 weeks ago. He was placing it, recalibrating, not sure yet what her return meant. He straightened, ma'am. She walked to the counter, set the canvas bundle down, began unwrapping it. She took her time. She had never been interested in theater, in building toward a reveal for the pleasure of the reaction, but the work deserved to be uncovered properly. The canvas came away in deliberate folds, each fold set aside, and then the rifle was on Tyler Brennan's counter under his fluorescent shop lights. The room changed, not dramatically, not all at once. The way a room changes when something enters it that has genuine weight. Not physical weight, the other kind. The kind that objects carry when they are what they are supposed to be. Tyler said nothing. This was remarkable. She had formed, in their first meeting, an accurate impression of Tyler Brennan as someone who managed silence by filling it. Not from insecurity, but from professional habit, the practice of someone who understood that in retail, silence was usually a problem to solve. He had been efficient, fluent, quick. Now he said nothing. He looked at the rifle, with calloused palms. She watched him look at it with the attention she gave to people looking at objects she'd restored. The specific attention that told her what they were seeing and what they were missing and whether they had the equipment to understand what was in front of them. He was seeing the finish first, the deep blue-black of the receiver and barrel, the color that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, the color that announced itself by not announcing itself. He'd worked with enough firearms to know what bluing looked like, and he was looking at this expressions, who was realized, someone, gradually, that what they were looking at was not what they expected to be looking at. Then the walnut, warm and rich under the shop lights, the grain running straight and tight. The finish smooth as something that had been worked over many hours by hands that had understood what smooth meant. And the fit, where the wood met the metal, where the stock joined the receiver, exact in the way that stopped being visible because it was so complete. He registered the fit. She could see the moment, the small adjustment of his expression, the recognition that this was not approximately right or commercially acceptable or close enough. This was exact. This was the kind of exact that didn't happen without weeks and skill and the willingness to keep working past the point where most people would have declared it done. He reached out, stopped before touching it, the instinct of someone who had been around quality long enough to understand that some things require permission. May I? Not quite a question. A held breath asking to be released. Yes, she said. He picked it up, both hands. Correctly. The weight distribution right, the positioning of someone who knew firearms structurally, even if he'd never understood them at this level. He worked the bolt, the shop filled with the sound of it. Clean. The specific clean of a mechanism fitted rather than assembled. The bolt cycling, with the precision that was audible, that announced itself without drama, that said simply and completely, "This is what this was made to be." Tyler stood behind his counter, holding the rifle with the expression of a man whose arithmetic was failing him. He checked the bore, held it to the light, looked at the rifling, still sharp, still clean, the rifling that had barely been used in 1918, and that a century in the ground had not degraded because the bore had been protected, and the electrolysis bath had been careful, and the work had been what it was. He set the rifle down, looked at the receiver markings, the Springfield roll mark, the serial number, picked it up again, could not seem to stop. "This can't be the same rifle," he said. His voice was different, quieter. Something had gone out of it, the professional register, the efficient management of customer interactions. Something more unguarded in its place. "It is," she said. He looked at her, at the rifle, at her again. "How long did this take you?" 8 days. He stared at her. 8 days. 8 days. He stopped, reconsidered, started again with more care. "I've read about museum-quality restorations, what they involve. Even basic conservation work on something at this level of deterioration would take a professional conservator longer," she said. "For most people." Yes. The silence after that was the kind that contained several things. She let it sit. She had learned 43 years ago, and refined ever since that silence, after a significant piece of information was not a problem to solve. You let the other person do their arithmetic. You let them arrive at the understanding themselves, because arriving yourself was different from being handed it, and the difference mattered. Tyler set the rifle down on the counter, looked at it for a long moment, then looked at her with the expression of a man who was beginning to understand that he was standing in a situation he had not correctly assessed. There were 3 other people in the shop. She'd registered them peripherally when she came in, the broad ambient awareness of a room's occupants that she'd developed in years of working in environments where knowing who was in the room mattered. A man in his 30s near the cleaning equipment on the left wall, a younger couple at the handgun display case on the far side, and a man on the right side of the shop near the accessories, shelves, who had gone very still when she began unwrapping the canvas. She noticed the stillness. It was a particular kind of stillness, not the frozen quality of someone surprised, but the deliberate stillness of someone who has recognized something and is deciding how to respond to that recognition. The stillness of someone with training, The man was in his late 60s. 60s, 70, 68. The specific physical architecture of someone who had carried significant weight, not just physical, the other kind, for a long time, and whose body had organized itself around that carrying. Close-cropped gray hair, a way of standing that didn't announce itself, and was therefore impossible to miss once you'd been trained to read it. The posture of someone who had spent years in environments where how you held yourself communicated things. He turned from the shelves, walked toward the counter, not hurrying. The walk of a man who had decided where he was going and had no need to rush about it. He looked at the rifle, then he looked at her. The look was different from Tyler's. It went somewhere else, accessed different information, processed through a different kind of training. Not the look of someone seeing an extraordinary object. The look of someone recognizing an extraordinary person. Voss, he said, just that, her name. Said in the way you say a name that has been in a specific compartment of your memory for a long time and has not been accessed recently but was always exactly where you left it. She looked at him, her brain doing the work that brains do when they're accessing stored information, running the match, checking variables, finding the configuration that corresponded to the face and this posture and this voice saying her name in this particular faulty way. The jawline, the set of the shoulders, the year, 1987, Fort Belvoir, the 3-week intensive. A cohort of 12 military personnel, requiring specialized knowledge of historical firearms, preservation and restoration. The kind of knowledge that the Army had decided it needed, and had decided she was the person to transmit. Third row, left side of the room. The one who asked questions that were better than the others. Not more numerous, not more aggressive, but more precisely aimed at the actual problem rather than its surface. Merrick, she said. He smiled small, real, the smile of someone who had been half hoping for this. Dwight Merrick. He stopped a few feet from the counter. I wasn't certain you'd remember. Third row left side, she said. You asked better questions than anyone else in the room. A pause. You said that to everyone. I did not. The specific pause of two people who knew each other from a particular context a long time ago and were now recalibrating for the present. Finding the angle at which the past and the present connected, the frequency at which they could communicate. You're in Lexington, he said. Have been for 40 years. I retired to Staunton 4 years ago. He looked at the rifle on the counter, his eyes on it now with full attention. Then back to her. Is that your work? Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Looking at the rifle with the eyes of someone who had enough training to understand what he was seeing. Not the full understanding she had. Nobody had that who hadn't spent 43 years doing it. But enough. Enough to understand the distance between what most people could do and what was in front of him. Then he turned to Tyler. Tyler, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man at the edge of a room, where a conversation is happening that he doesn't fully understand but understands, is about him. Son, Merrick said. Tyler looked at him. Merrick's voice was even, factual. The tone of someone delivering information he considered basic. Do you know who this woman is? Tyler's eyes moved to her. Back to Merrick. She came in a couple of weeks ago, he said, carefully, with that rifle. And I told her it wasn't. What she brought you, Merrick said, was a Springfield model, 1903. The primary American infantry rifle of both world wars. One of the most historically significant military firearms in this country's history. He said it without heat or drama, just information. What she just placed on your counter is a museum-quality restoration. I have seen work at this level exactly twice in 40 years of working with historical firearms. Twice. Both times it was her work. Tyler said nothing. I spent 3 weeks in her classroom in 1987, Merrick continued. Fort Belvoir. She was running the Army's historical firearms, restoration and preservation program. Classified work. The kind of work that ends up in the Smithsonian, in presidential libraries, in collections that this country considers part of its national patrimony. He looked at Meredith. You'd been at it how long by that point? 18 years, he nodded. 43 years total, he said to Tyler. Working in facilities that aren't on any public map. Restoring objects that most Americans have seen behind glass, without knowing who gave them back what they were. A pause. Long enough to be deliberate. And 2 weeks ago, you told her to throw it in the trash. The shop had gone completely quiet. The man near the cleaning equipment had stopped pretending to examine cleaning equipment. The couple at the handgun case had turned around. Everyone in the room was very still, in the way that people are still when something real is happening, and they don't want to miss it. Tyler Brennan stood behind his counter and said nothing for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated and internal. She recognized it, had seen versions of it over 43 years in various rooms, on various faces. The specific reckoning of a person who has been wrong in a way that cannot be contextualized or explained away, or distributed across a list of contributing factors. The kind of wrong that goes all the way down to something structural, to the way you look at people and reach conclusions before you've looked at them properly. He looked at the rifle, at Meredith, at Merrick. Back at the rifle, ma'am, he said. His voice was different from 2 weeks ago. Not the polished efficiency of a professional managing an interaction. Something underneath that. Something that had come up from a place he didn't usually let be audible. I was wrong. Simple. No architecture around it. No qualification. No context setting. No distribution of responsibility across the circumstances. Not just about the rifle. He held her gaze, the effort of it visible. About you. I made a judgment in approximately 4 seconds based on what I saw, and I was completely wrong. Not slightly wrong. Not wrong about the specific question of whether the rifle was restorable. He paused. Wrong about who I was talking to. Wrong about what I was looking at. And I don't. He stopped. There isn't a way to dress that up. So I'm not going to try. She looked at him. 29 years old. Genuinely skilled in the ways he'd been trained to be skilled. And honest enough, right now, in this moment, with everyone watching, not to perform his way through what he owed. That mattered. The rifle wasn't the test, she said. He waited. The quietest moment the room had offered. I know, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Thinking about Fort Belvoir in 1987 and the 12 people in 3 rows, the specific quality that distinguished the ones who could grow from the ones who were finished growing. The quality that showed itself not in talent or speed or technical knowledge, but in the ability to be wrong in front of a people. And not spend the next 10 minutes finding ways to be less wrong. She thought she was looking at it. Don't do that again, she said. Whatever comes through that door, however it looks, whatever it's carrying, you look at it properly before you decide what it is. A pause. Especially people, he nodded. Not the professional nod, the other one. Would you? He stopped. Reformulated, started again more carefully. I know I have no right to ask this, but would you be willing to show me what I don't see? Not a restoration project. Not a specific technical skill. The approach. The way he looked at the rifle. Back at her. I thought I knew this. I'm standing here looking at that and realizing I don't know what I don't know. Which is the worst kind of not knowing. That phrase. The worst kind of not knowing. She hadn't expected that from him. The precision of it. The self-awareness required to produce it. She looked at Dwight Merrick, who was watching her, with the expression of a man who had been this specific thing would happen, and was watching it happen. She thought about Thomas's note above the bench. The best work is the work nobody sees. She thought about 43 years of classified rooms and unmarked buildings, and work that mattered without attribution, without acknowledgement, without anyone knowing whose hands had done it. And she thought, teaching is different from working alone. Teaching is the work continuing past you. Teaching is the only kind of legacy that actually matters because it lives in other people's hands rather than behind glass. Skill without patience, she said to Tyler, is just speed. And speed breaks things. He was listening. Fully. The kind of listening that is also writing things down somewhere internal. You start there, she said. We'll see what comes next. Marek walked her to the truck. She hadn't invited him. He'd fallen into step beside her, with the ease of someone who had something left to say and was working out how to begin saying it. Main Street going about its Tuesday morning business around them. Ordinary, self-contained. The town that didn't need anyone to find it remarkable. You look well, he said. You're being polite. I'm being accurate. He walked with his hands in his jacket pockets, the October air crisp enough to justify the jacket. Widowed? 5 years, I'm sorry. Truly, thank you. They reached the truck. She set the canvas. Empty now. The rifle left on Tyler's counter while the donation paperwork was arranged, which was getting ahead of itself, but she was already thinking about the next step, on the passenger seat. Did you retire completely? Marek asked. After 2012? I thought I had. He looked at her sideways. And now? She thought about the workshop, the tools on their racks, Thomas's note above the tape fused with the paint. The Colt she'd provisionally agreed to look at. Preliminary assessment only, she'd told Marcus just to see, sitting in a padded case under the bench at home. I'm reconsidering, she said. Marek smiled. The first full smile she'd seen from him today. It changed his whole register. From formal to human. The way his smile had always worked, which she remembered from 1987, because it had been distinctive then too. There's a Historical Arms Preservation Society meeting in Richmond, he said, next month. Private collectors, 2 museum curators, a historian from UVA who's been doing work on the 29th Division that I think would interest you specifically. He paused. 3 projects they've been unable to staff because they can't find anyone with the right combination of experience. Bessa, I know because they asked me if I knew anyone, and I said I used to, but had lost track. She looked at him. Now you've found me. Now I've found you, he said it simply, the way he'd always said things, as if facts were sufficient without decoration. Send you the details? Yes. Yes, ma'am, his smile again. I'll be in touch. She got in the truck, rolled the window down, 3 rotations of the hand crank, the seal slightly stiff with the cold. The mechanical intimacy of a very old vehicle that required its operator to participate in everything. Because there was one more thing. Marek, he looked at her from the sidewalk. You really did ask better questions than anyone else, he laughed. A real one. Short and genuine, the laugh of someone who wasn't expecting it and was pleased to be surprised. She started the truck. It coughed. She patted the dashboard, drove home. Noelle was on the porch when she got back. 2 cups of coffee, which meant she'd let herself in and made herself at home in the kitchen, in the way she almost never did. The way she'd been invited to 100 times and almost never taken up, out of a careful respect for space that Meredith appreciated and had occasionally wished Noelle would abandon more often. The fact that she'd done it today, the fact that she was on the porch with 2 cups, said something. Meredith wasn't sure exactly what, but it said something, and she accepted it the way she accepted most such things. Noelle communicated through action rather than words. As information, as the form care took when Noelle wasn't sure words would land correctly. She parked, walked to the porch, accepted the cup. How did it go? Not quite a question. The tone of someone who had been waiting and had been practicing being calm about the waiting. He apologized. Noelle nodded once, absorbing, and someone else was there. Someone I knew years ago. From the work, she drank the coffee. Better than her own, which she was not going to say out loud. He told me about some projects in Richmond. Are you going to do them? I'm thinking about it. Noelle looked at her with her father's gray-green eyes, the downward tilt at the corners. The expression of someone who knew the difference between her mother thinking about something and her mother having already decided and describing the deciding as thinking. Mom, are you actually thinking about it? Or have you already decided and thinking about it is just how you're presenting it to me? Meredith considered this. The second one, she said. Noelle made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something that lived in the complicated territory between exasperated and relieved. The sound of a daughter who had been worried about her mother in a specific way and had just discovered the specific worry was unnecessary, which was both good news and somewhat annoying. Okay, she said, just that they stood on the porch. The October valley around them. The amber oak, the haze on the Blue Ridge. The particular quality of afternoon light in October that was different from September light. Warmer in color, but cooler in temperature. The light that made everything look like it was being photographed rather than simply existing. I found his notebook. Meredith said. Noelle went still. Thomas's. In the workshop. He'd left a box there for me. When did he? I don't know exactly when. Before he died. He'd been keeping the notebook for years. I could see from the dates. Writing things down when something mattered enough. Noelle's voice, when she spoke, was careful, soft. The voice she used when she wasn't sure what the ground was like. Was it hard to read? Some of it. She looked at the old oak. He said he was watching. The whole time. That he watched me work. In the workshop. For 30 years. And he understood what it was even when he didn't understand the specifics of what I was doing. She held the cup. He said it was enough. Being there. Watching. That it was more than enough. Was it enough? Noelle asked. For you. That he knew. She had asked herself this question at 2 in the morning on the workshop floor, with the notebook in her lap. Had been asking it ever since, in the spaces between work, in the places where grief lived in a life that was otherwise fully occupied. Yes, she said, and meant it all the way down. Noelle put her arm around her mother's shoulders. Not speaking, just there. The particular presence of someone who has finally, completely, understood something about the person beside them and doesn't need to articulate the understanding. Because the understanding itself is the thing. They stood on the porch while the afternoon held them both. She brought the rifle to VMI on the following Tuesday. Dr. Patricia Hale met her at the museum entrance. Mid-50s, the specific energy of someone who worked with important things in a place that didn't get the attention it deserved and had made a long peace with that gap. Reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. A handshake that meant what it was. Firm, present. The handshake of someone who understood that objects mattered because people mattered, and people deserved the same quality of attention that objects received. The display case was already prepared. This surprised her. She'd expected its institutional process. The discussions, the paperwork, the measured institutional pace of getting something properly cited. But the case was there. Glass, proper lighting, velvet rest. The light positioned to illuminate the finish without washing it out. The case of someone who had been briefed carefully and had done their preparation. She unwrapped the canvas, set the Springfield on the velvet rest, stepped back, looked at it, the 1903 Springfield. Manufactured 1918 at the Springfield Armory, Massachusetts. Shipped to the 116th Infantry Regiment, Virginia National Guard. Assigned to Private Clarence Aldridge, Augusta County, Virginia. Carried to France with the 29th Division. Returned home, somehow, by means the record didn't describe, to the county where it had begun buried. Found in a garden bed in September 2024. Form, whom name had not appeared in any public record for 43 years. Retard. Dr. Hale stood beside her. She gave the moment its moment, which Meredith appreciated more than she could have easily expressed. The rarity of someone who understood that some things required the pause before the business. The plaque text, Dr. Hale said. I have a draft. I'd like you to approve it before we finalize. She handed Meredith a small card, the rifle's history, the regiment, Private Clarence Aldridge. The provenance, found in a garden in Lexington, Virginia in September 2024. The restoration, and at the bottom, restored by Meredith Voss, Lexington, Virginia 2024. Her name. On a plaque, in a room where anyone could walk in and read it. She stood with the card in her hands. 43 years. 43 years of rooms that didn't officially exist, of work that couldn't be attributed, of classified corridors and unmarked buildings, and the particular solitude of doing things that mattered enormously, and that you could not once describe to the person sleeping beside you. 43 years of the best work being the work nobody sees, because Thomas was right about that, because she believed it, because the work didn't need to be seen to be real. But here was her name, on a small card, in a room with good light. Thomas had known. He'd written it in a note box in the back of a workshop, and she'd found it in the middle of a project and sat on the floor and cried. He had known, and it had been enough. And here was her name anyway, out loud, where anyone could see it. Both things could be true. "It's right," she said, her voice steady. She made it steady. "We're glad," Dr. Hale said. Noelle was there. She'd driven up that morning without explanation, had simply appeared at the farmhouse and said she wanted to come, which Meredith had accepted because some things didn't require negotiation. Noelle read the plaque text over her shoulder, was quiet for a moment. "It should say, Master Gunsmith," she said. Dr. Hale looked at her, then at Meredith. "It can," she said. Meredith looked at her daughter, 49 years old. Thomas's eyes. The stubbornness that had arrived from somewhere. "Yes," Meredith said. "All right." They stood together in front of the case, the rifle behind the glass. The light falling on it the way she'd hoped it would, finding the depth of the finish, bringing up the warmth in the walnut, making visible the quality of what had been done to bring it back. She thought about Clarence Aldridge in France in 1918, 19 years old, far from Augusta County. The mountains he'd grown up looking at on the other side of an ocean, and this rifle in his hands, this rifle that he had not, apparently, fired in anger, that he had carried and returned with, and kept and buried. He could not have imagined this room, this light, her hands. She could not have imagined it either, once. Not this specific room on this specific Tuesday, with her name on the plaque and her daughter's arm against hers. You don't imagine these things, you do the work, and sometimes the work finds its way here regardless. Tyler Brennan called on a Thursday. She had been expecting the call in the general sense. She'd told him to start there, and he'd understood the implicit invitation. But not the specific Thursday, not the specific way he'd begin. "I've been reading," he said, no preamble, which she appreciated. "What have you been reading?" "Everything I can find about period restoration. Springfield Armory production records, historical bluing techniques, the metallurgy of early 20th century military steel." A pause. "I found references to your work in archival materials from the Army's Historical Preservation Program. Your name is cited as a source, not a full name, just Voss, in 3 different technical documents from the 80s. I didn't know it was you until I thought about it." She said nothing. "I'd like to come to the workshop," he said. "If you're willing. I know I don't have a basis to ask. But I'd like to Saturday," she said. 9 in the morning. "Call before you leave." "Yes, ma'am, and don't be late." I start at 5, and by 9 I've already been working for 4 hours, and I don't like interruptions in the middle of something." "Understood." She hung up, made a note in her notebook. Saturday, belt buckle. She had a piece she kept specifically for this purpose. A 19th century belt buckle she'd found at an estate sale in 2003. Acquired because it presented an interesting pattern of differential corrosion, heavier on one side than the other, in a way that told a specific story about how it had been stored or used that she found instructive. She'd never given it to anyone. She'd kept it because it asked good questions, and good questions were worth keeping. He arrived at 9:02, which she acknowledged without comment. He came in and stood in the middle of the workshop. The way she'd stood in the middle of the workshop the first time she walked back into it, taking it in before moving, giving himself time to understand this before he tried to do anything in it. She watched him do this and thought, good. He's actually looking, not categorizing. Looking, where do I start, he said. She set the belt buckle on the bench under the lamp. There, he moved to the bench, looked at the buckle. She handed him the magnifying glass, her spare, the one she kept for exactly this kind of moment, and he took it and brought it close and adjusted the angle and went quiet. A minute passed. She waited. The corrosion is uneven, he said. Heavier on this side. Why? A pause. How it was stored. The orientation when it was in the ground. If it was buried. And what does that tell you? Longer pause. She could see him working it through, not reaching for the answer he thought she wanted. Working it through how it got where it is, he said slowly, not just what it is, but the history of how it ended up in this condition. She said nothing, because that was the answer. And sometimes the best response to a right answer was to let it stand without adding to it. He looked back at the buckle. That's different from what I do, he said. I look at what something is, not how it became what it is. Yes, he paused. That's actually a different way of seeing. It's not just a different technique. It's a different question you're asking at the start. Yes, she said again. He was quiet for a moment. How long did it take you? To make that the first question automatically. Long enough that I can't tell you when it happened. She moved the lamp slightly. That's how you know something has become yours. When you can't remember not having it. He stayed for 3 hours. She showed him the difference between corrosion that had protected the underlying metal and corrosion that had consumed it. Not told him, showed him, with samples, and the loop and the specific experience of hands-on examination that transmitted what explanation alone couldn't. The feel of a surface that had survived under its corrosion versus one that hadn't. The visual cues, the information that lived in weight distribution and surfaced geometry and particular light moved across a treated versus an untreated area. She showed him how to hold a component during assessment. The wrist position. The way the fingers supported without pressing, letting the object's weight communicate rather than fighting it. The way you learn to receive information through your hands, instead of just imposing on the material. She showed him how to be wrong efficiently. You'll misread things, she said. I still misread things after 43 years. The goal is to be wrong early and cheaply, in the assessment phase, before you've committed to a treatment approach. Wrong after treatment is expensive. Wrong before treatment is information. How do you know when you're about to misread something? You develop a feeling, a hesitation, a sense that something isn't adding up the way it should. She turned the belt buckle over. You learn to take that feeling seriously instead of pushing through it. How long does that take to develop? You're starting now. He looked at the buckle for a long moment. What's the story on this one? He asked. This specific buckle. Where did it come from? She set it down between them. Estate sale, she said. 2003. A farm outside Harrisonburg that had been in the same family since before the Civil War. The owner's estate was being settled, and the family sold everything. She looked at the buckle. When I cleaned it properly, I found initials. JHV and a date, 1862. Tyler was quiet. Someone's ancestor, he said. Someone's great-great-grandfather, by now probably. Maybe further back. She looked at the initials, still visible in the cleaned metal. I kept it. Never gave it to anyone, never sold it. Some things you keep because they're still waiting for the right question. He looked at the buckle for a long time. You're teaching me to ask better questions, he said. I'm teaching you to ask questions at all, she said. Before you answer. Before you reach a conclusion. Before you look at something for 4 seconds and decide you understand. She paused. That's where you start. Questions first. Conclusions later. He smiled. Small. Genuine. The smile of someone at the beginning of something, who knows they're at the beginning and isn't embarrassed by it. She thought, there it is. The thing that makes someone actually teachable. Not talent, not technical aptitude. The willingness to be a beginner. The willingness to sit with not knowing long enough for the knowing to actually arrive. He came back the following Saturday. He came back the Saturday after that. The questions got better, not linearly, not steadily improving week to week in a way you could graph. In jumps. Long plateaus followed by sudden leaps that surprised even him. The way real learning surprised people who hadn't done enough to recognize the pattern. He would spend 3 Saturdays working at one level, and then, on the 4th Saturday, ask a question that was clearly from a different level, and she would know that something had connected that hadn't been connected before. She began bringing out more complex pieces, moving from the belt buckle to a Civil War-era revolver that presented different problems, then to a flintlock pistol with provenance issues embedded in its condition that required reading the object as a kind of document. Each piece asked different questions. Each piece required him to apply what he'd been learning to a new configuration. He made mistakes. She let him make them, then walked him back through the mistake to the point where it had been made, and showed him what the correct reading of the information would have been, not to shame, to locate, to make the error specific enough that it became a fixed point in his knowledge rather than a vague cautionary sense that he could ignore. "You'll misread things," she'd told him on the first Saturday. "I still misread things." She meant it. 3 weeks in, she misread the condition of a lock mechanism on the Civil War revolver, assessed a component as damaged beyond function that turned out, on closer examination, to be seizable but structurally sound. She caught it herself, showed him the error and the correction without making it significant. "That's how it goes," she said. He looked at her. "Even for you, especially for me," she said. "I've been doing this long enough to have very confident wrong opinions sometimes. Confidence is not the same as accuracy. You learn that the hard way a few times, and then you remember it." He wrote something in the small notebook he'd started bringing. She didn't comment on the notebook, but she noticed it, and she was glad. The Richmond meeting was on the 2nd Thursday of November. She drove herself. The highway in the cold, the pickup running slightly rough at highway speeds, in the way it had been running slightly rough. At highway speeds for the past year, the particular roughness of an engine that was managing its age rather than transcending it. She'd been meaning to have it looked at. She continued, meaning to have it looked at. The truck continued getting her where she was going. The meeting was in a private room at a hotel in downtown Richmond that had the specific quality of rooms where people who cared about things gathered to talk about them. Comfortable without being luxurious, functional without being institutional. The kind of room that was organized around a table and a conversation rather than around an impression. 12 people. She recognized the type before she recognized the individuals. Collectors who knew their collections the way she knew her work. Deeply, specifically, with the particular attachment of people who had spent real time with real objects and understood the difference between owning something and understanding it. 2 museum curators with the focused attention of people who spent their days with objects that outlasted people and had absorbed something of that durability themselves. A historian from UVA who turned out to be younger than she'd expected, early 40s maybe, and better read than she'd hoped, which was the pleasant surprise of someone who had been prepared to be disappointed and wasn't. Dwight Merrick was there. He nodded at her from across the room. She nodded back. She sat down. Someone offered coffee, black. She accepted. The meeting began. The Colt First, Single Action Army, 1870s. The collector, a quiet man in his mid-70s named Everett Calloway, who handled his piece with the reverence of someone for whom the object was genuinely personal, not precious, not trophy-like, but personal. He'd had it for 30 years. His father had had it before him, acquired in 1952 at an auction whose records had since been lost. The documented provenance went back only to that 1952 acquisition. What lay before it was undocumented. He set it on the table. She looked at it, properly. The full attention. The way she'd been looking at things for 43 years, not at the surface but through it, at what the surface was evidence of, the finish patterns, the distribution of wear, the specific characteristics of the cylinder face, the way the grip had been handled differently from the way the metal had been handled, two distinct patterns of use superimposed on each other. This wasn't always a listener piece, she said. Everett looked at her. I'm sorry? The grip wear is inconsistent with the metal wear. Different rates, different patterns. She looked at the cylinder face. This was a working firearm at some point, carried regularly, handled regularly, used in the way that working tools are used. Then that stopped. The metal wear pattern slows noticeably. Here, here, and here. She indicated the points. The grip wear continues but differently. Someone kept carrying it after they stopped using it. She looked up at the room. Sometime in the 1890s, approximately. The change in the pattern is consistent with a shift from use to keepsake status. Someone decided to keep it without using it. She paused. Someone kept carrying it. After they stopped firing it, the room was quiet. Everett looked at the Colt with the expression she recognized. The expression of someone seeing an object they thought they knew and finding it more than they'd known, which was not a diminishment. That was the beginning of knowing more. That was always the beginning of knowing more. He stopped. I never noticed that. It's subtle. How did you? Pattern recognition, she said. And time. Mostly time. The conversation continued. 3 hours of it. The Colt's pre-1923 provenance, which turned out to be reconstructible from the wear analysis in ways that hadn't been considered before. The flintlock pair, an 18th century matched set with provenance issues that were interesting rather than problematic, once the right questions were applied to the physical evidence. The second Springfield, a different model from a different era, presenting a different set of problems that required different knowledge but the same underlying approach. Look first, ask questions, reach conclusions last. She was in the middle of it, not managing, not performing, not maintaining the careful posture of someone in an unfamiliar situation, just present, contributing, offering what she knew in the same tone she received what others knew, the specific quality of a conversation among people who understood the same thing from different angles. She realized, somewhere in the second hour, what she'd been missing, not the work. The work was its own thing and always would be. The particular satisfaction of it. The physical and intellectual engagement of it. The specific pleasure of a process that was demanding and finite and produced something real that she'd been missing, but that she'd been recovering. What she'd missed in a different way was this. The conversation around the work. The community of people who didn't need it. Explained why a wear pattern on a 19th century revolver was worth 3 hours of careful attention. Who shared the underlying assumption that objects contained their histories and that those histories mattered and that recovering them was worth the effort. Thomas had been her community of one for 41 years, and he'd been enough. She'd meant what she'd said to Noel. He'd been more than enough, but this was also something. Both things could be true. That Thomas had been everything, and that this was also something. That the work done alone was complete, and that the work shared was different, in a way that added to rather than replaced the solitude. Both things. She drove home in the dark, the highway first, then the valley roads. The mountains invisible in the November, dark but present the way they were always present. Not because you could see them, but because they were there. Had been there before she arrived and would be there after she was gone. The Blue Ridge in the dark was the same Blue Ridge in the light. It didn't need to be seen to be real. The truck coughed on the off-ramp. She patted the dashboard. I know. She too, the morning after Richmond, 4:51. Not quite 4:47, but moving toward it. The body's clock finding its new rhythm, settling into the pace that the work required, the pace that was different from the retirement pace, earlier, more purposeful, the specific, Waking of someone who had somewhere to be, coffee. Black. Thomas's chair. The valley outside the kitchen window. Going gold at the edge, the November gold that was different from September gold, thinner and lower. The light of a season preparing to end. She sat with the cup and looked at the workshop through the window. The Colt under the bench, in its padded case. The cylinder problem she'd been thinking about since Charlottesville. The specific complication of the late 1870s action that required a different approach from the 1903 Springfield, a different vocabulary of technique. Tyler's last question on Saturday, about the difference between period-appropriate and period-identical in Restoration philosophy. A question that had no short answer and that she'd been working out how to explain in a way that transmitted the reasoning rather than just the conclusion. She thought about Noel's Thanksgiving visit, confirmed now, with the conversation about the work finally, after 49 years, on the table. Not the classified details, the shape of it, the what it felt like of it. What Noel had been looking at through the workshop window for 40 years without understanding what she was looking at. She thought about Dwight Marek and the 3 projects in Richmond and the specific satisfaction of a conversation among people who understood the same things from different angles. She thought about Tyler on his stool on Saturday mornings, the questions getting better, the particular quality of a student who was genuinely at the beginning of something rather than performing the beginning. She thought about Clarence Aldridge from Augusta County, whose rifle was behind glass in a room at VM with her name on the plaque. What he had thought he was ending when he put it in the ground. What he could not have known he was beginning. She finished the coffee put on the green clothes, the faded ones with the stain on the left knee that Noel kept threatening to throw away. The ones that were perfectly good clothes, laced her boots. Left over right, loop on the right side first, picked up her notebook, walked across the yard, the workshop door. She pushed it open. The smell, linseed oil, and metal and wood and time. The atmosphere of a place where 40 years of careful work had happened, then 5 years of silence, then work again. The 2 histories layered in the air of it, the absence and the presence both. The way she'd come to think of Thomas. Not as gone, but as having been here, as a specific, permanent quality of someone who had been in a place long enough that the place kept them. She clicked on the work lamp, good light. The Colt was on the bench where she'd left it. The cylinder problem waiting with the patience of a problem that knows it will be addressed. The notebook open beside the bench, the pencil in the groove where she always left it. She sat down, put on the magnifying glasses, pulled the lamp close, her hands on the bench in front of her. The spots, the swollen right knuckle, the slight tremor that was fatigue and nothing else. That was the body's morning conversation with itself, before it remembered what it was doing and settled into it. Hands that a general had once shaken in a room without a public address and called irreplaceable. Hots. Made a cup of coffee, callout palms. Hands that had made its boy sucked. And handed it to a man who sat on a stool and watched and boxed and wrote it down and left a box in the back of the book because he knew she would find it when she needed to. Hands that had pulled a rusted rifle from a garden bed in September and known immediately what it was and what it needed and who was going to give it. That hands, still here. Still knowing. She picked up the probe, slender, precise, asking for exactly the right amount of pressure and no more and no less, which was the whole of it, really. The whole of everything she'd spent 43 years learning, not more and not less. Exactly what the work required, exactly what the object deserved. Outside, the valley was waking up. The light coming over the Blue Ridge the way it always came. The same light it had been, for longer than anyone kept records. The light that didn't care who was watching, or whether anyone was watching. The light that showed up regardless. The November light, thin and gold, falling on 30 acres of Virginia, and one workshop, behind one farmhouse, and one woman at one bench who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She wasn't looking at the light. She was looking at the work, which was where she had always been. The probe moved over the cylinder's surface, slowly, deliberately, with the full attention of someone who had spent a lifetime learning that every object in front of you contains a story, and that your only job, your one job, the job that required everything and gave everything back, was to understand that story well enough to tell the truth about it. The workshop held her, quiet, warm, the warmth of a space that had been returned to itself after a long absence and had not forgotten what it was. And somewhere out in the valley, under the soil of 30 acres and the soil of a county and the soil of a state that had been sending its young people to wars, for as long as anyone had been keeping records, other objects were waiting, other stories, other things buried by people who couldn't have imagined the morning when someone would find them and know what they were and bring them back. She was still here, her hands still new. The morning had arrived, as it always did, exactly on time.